The wedding marquee at Fairleigh Hall glowed amber against the September dusk, strung with lanterns that swayed on the evening breeze, and beneath them, 300 guests in silk and brocade laughed at jokes they would forget by morning. Wren Calloway stood near the edge of it all, in a gown 2 seasons out of fashion, watching the light catch on jewels she would never own. In a world she had been born, just close enough to touch, and just far enough to never truly belong. She was 25, slender and quiet, with pale copper hair pinned low against the nape of her neck and hazel eyes that missed very little. Her father had been a respected land agent, a man the old Earl had trusted with the management of half his tenant farms, and for a time, the Calloway name had meant something in Ashcombe Valley. Then her father had died, owing more than he had ever let on, and the debts had swallowed the modest house, the small savings, everything but Wren's education and her wits. Since then, she had lived on the goodwill of relations who reminded her, in 100 small and pointed ways, that goodwill was not the same as belonging. Lady Constance Fairleigh found her by the punch table an hour into the celebration. Constance was the Earl's wife, a handsome woman with a smile that never reached her eyes when she looked at poor relations, and she had brought with her 2 ladies from London whose diamonds caught the lantern light like small cold stars. "Wren, dear," Constance said, in the particular voice she used for servants and charity cases alike, "you remember Mrs. Hartwell and Lady Delacroix. I was just telling them how generous Edmund has been, taking you in after your father's unfortunate business." The word landed exactly where it was meant to land. Mrs. Hartwell's gaze swept over Wren's altered gown with the swift, cataloguing pity of a woman assessing a stray dog someone had been kind enough to feed. "How good of the family," she murmured, "to keep her on." "We could hardly do otherwise," Constance said, laying a hand briefly on Wren's arm as though she were something to be patted rather than spoken to. "Poor thing has nowhere else to go. It's rather like keeping a favorite old horse past its usefulness. One simply can't turn it out to pasture." The laughter that followed was soft, well-bred, and utterly without mercy. Wren felt the heat climb her throat and forced her face into the same pleasant stillness she had worn for 3 years, the mask that cost her nothing to hold and everything to keep holding. She excused herself with a curtsy so correct it could not be faulted, and walked, not ran, never ran toward the dark edge of the garden, where the lantern light gave way to real night, and no one could see, her hands shaking. It was there that Julian Ashworth found her, though neither of them would have called it finding exactly. He was leaning against the old stone wall that marked the boundary of the Fairleigh Gardens, a glass of brandy forgotten in his hand, watching the party with the detached weariness of a man who had buried a wife 2 years before, and had not yet remembered how to enjoy anything since. He was master of Thornmere, the estate bordering Fairleigh Land to the west, and though he was invited to every gathering in the valley, he attended fewer of them each year. "They do that every time," he said, not quite looking at her. "Constance and her collection of vultures. I've watched her do it to 3 different companions before you." Wren said nothing. She did not know him well enough to know if this was sympathy or simply an observation, and she had learned not to trust the difference. "You didn't cry," he added, after a moment. "Most people would have." "Crying wouldn't change anything," she said. "It would only give them something else to discuss over breakfast." He looked at her then, properly, for perhaps the first time in the 2 years. They had occasionally shared a room at gatherings like this one. Something in her flat, steady voice seemed to catch his attention the way nothing at the wedding had. "No," he agreed slowly. "I don't suppose it would." They did not speak again that night, but Wren carried the exchange home with her, small and strange, a single warm coal in a very cold week. What? No one at Fairleigh Hall knew what Wren had gone to great lengths to ensure no one knew, was that she had spent the last 2 years quietly rebuilding the very skill for which her father had once been valued, and doing it not for the family who sheltered her out of obligation, but for herself, in secret, under a name that was not her own. It had started with the Whitmore farm, the smallest and most neglected of the tenant holdings on Fairleigh Land. Old Mr. Whitmore, drowning in debt and too proud to admit it, had come to her one evening because her father had once helped his father, and because he did not know where else to turn. Wren had spent 3 nights going over his ledgers by candlelight, using everything she had absorbed, as a girl sitting quietly in her father's study while he worked the drainage schemes, the crop rotations, the patient arithmetic of turning a failing piece of land profitable again. She had written her recommendations under the name W.C. Calloway, deliberately ambiguous, and let Mr. Whitmore believe, if he wished, that some cousin of hers had done the work. The Whitmore farm had turned a profit within a year. Word, in a valley as small as Ashcombe, traveled quietly, but it traveled far. A second tenant came to her, then a third. By the time of the wedding, Wren was managing anonymously. Through careful letters and evening consultations, she told her relations were visits to old school friends, the accounts and land management of nearly a dozen small holdings across the valley, each one clawing its way back from the edge of ruin under her quiet, unacknowledged guidance. She took no credit and very little payment, only enough to save, coin by coin, toward a future she did not yet dare name aloud, even to herself. It was not power she wanted, it was simply somewhere to put the parts of herself that Fairleigh Hall had no use for. Autumn deepened into a hard, early winter, and with it came trouble Wren had not anticipated. The Earl's own estate, it turned out, was not as sound as its lanterns and its wedding marquee suggested. Edmund Fairleigh had spent freely for years on the assumption that his lands would always provide, and a series of poor harvests, combined with his own inattention, had left Fairleigh Hall quietly, catastrophically overextended. By December, the family solicitor was making increasingly urgent visits, and Constance's diamonds had begun disappearing from her jewelry box one piece at a time, sold to cover debts no one spoke of at dinner. It was Julian who first put the pieces together. Julian, who had begun finding reasons to call at Fairleigh Hall more often that winter, and who had noticed, with the sharp attention of a man newly interested in someone, how often Wren disappeared on quiet errands, how the Whitmore farm had a new roof, how 3 other struggling holdings in the valley had somehow righted themselves under circumstances no one could quite explain. He said nothing of his suspicions until the night he found her in the estate's small library, going over figures by lamplight while the rest of the house slept. W.C. Calloway, he said quietly, from the doorway, and watched, her hand still on the page. I made some inquiries. It took me longer than it should have to realize the initials weren't a cousin's. Wren set down her pen very carefully. And what do you intend to do with that information? Nothing, he said, coming further into the room, except, perhaps ask why a woman with your gift for this work has spent 3 years letting Constance Fairleigh call her a stray dog at dinner parties. Because a stray dog with the talent for land management is still, to people like Constance, a stray dog, Wren said. And there was no self-pity in it, only exhaustion. Skill doesn't buy belonging, Mr. Ashworth. I learned that a long time ago. Perhaps not from people like Constance, he said, but I imagine it buys something more useful than belonging. In the end, he held her gaze a moment to long for simple neighborly interest, and Wren felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, something that was not quite loneliness. The crisis, when it broke fast. 2 days before Christmas, the Fairleigh solicitor arrived with news that could not be softened. Without immediate and substantial reorganization, the family would lose not only the London house, but very possibly Fairleigh Hall itself, within the year. Edmund, stripped of his composure for the first time Wren had ever witnessed, sat pale and silent at the head of his own dinner table while Constance wept into a handkerchief that had likely cost more than a tenant farmer's monthly wage. It was Julian, in the end, who suggested carefully, watching Wren's face as he said it, that the family might do well to consult someone with a proven record of rescuing failing estates in the valley. There's no one of that description in Ashcombe, Constance said, dabbing her eyes. Everyone competent has gone to London. There is someone, Julian said, closer than you think. It took Edmund 3 days to swallow his pride enough to ask, and when he finally did, cornering Wren in the very garden where his wife had once compared her to an aging horse. His voice was rough with an emotion he clearly was not accustomed to feeling. "The Whitmore farm," he said. "The Hensley land. Old Cartwright's holding. That was you." "Yes," Wren said simply. "3 years," Edmund said. "And you never once mentioned it." "You never once asked what I did with my evenings," Wren said. "You only ever asked why I hadn't married yet, or reminded me how fortunate I was to have a roof." Edmund had the grace, at least, to look ashamed. "I am asking now," he said. "I am asking you to save my family's home, Wren. I have no right to it." "But I am asking." She could have refused. Some deep, tired part of her wanted to let Fairleigh Hall crumble the way its warmth toward her had crumbled years before. But Wren had never done her work out of spite, and she found, standing in that cold garden, that she did not intend to start now. "I'll do it," she said. "Not because your family, because the tenants on this land depend on it staying solvent, and because I'm good at this. And because I have spent 3 years being told my usefulness ends at pouring tea. I'd like, for once, to prove otherwise." She worked through the worst of the winter with a fury and precision that startled everyone who had only ever seen her quiet. She restructured Fairleigh's debts, renegotiated terms with 3 separate creditors, reorganized the tenant leases, with an eye toward fairness that increased yields more than penny pinching ever could have, and brought in, one by one, the network of small landholders she had quietly rescued over the previous years, men and women who trusted her completely, and who, at her request, agreed to a cooperative arrangement that strengthened every estate in the valley at once, Fairleigh included. By the first thaw, the valley's finances had not merely stabilized, they had transformed. What had been a scattered collection of struggling, isolated holdings became, under Wren's quiet architecture, something like a single thriving system, each estate supporting the others, all of it running through ledgers that bore, at last, and without apology, her own true name. The Earl of Fairleigh, who 3 months earlier had allowed his wife to call her a charity case in front of London society, now deferred to her judgment in matters concerning his own land. Neighboring landowners who had never spared her a second glance began sending letters, requesting her counsel. Even Constance, in her own stiff and grudging way, began introducing her differently at gatherings, not as a poor relation, kept out of obligation, but as our Miss Calloway, without whom I don't know what would have become of us. Wren accepted none of it with triumph. She had not done the work to be vindicated, but she would be lying if she said there was no quiet satisfaction in walking into Fairleigh Hall now, and being met, finally, with the respect that should have cost her nothing to earn 3 years before. Julian found her again in February, in the same garden, though this time the ground was hard with frost instead of soft with September warmth, and there were no lanterns, only a clear, cold sky full of stars. "Every estate in the valley answers to you now," he said, coming to stand beside her at the old stone wall. "I imagine that includes mine, if I asked nicely enough." "Thornmare's accounts are perfectly sound," Wren said. "You don't need my help." "No," he agreed, "but I find I'd like your company regardless, which is a rather different request than the one I imagine you're used to fielding these days." She looked at him, then really looked, the way she had not quite let herself do since that first cold night by this same wall. "I spent 3 years being useful to people who never once asked what I wanted," she said. "I find I'm not eager to repeat the arrangement." "Then I'll ask," Julian said, and there was nothing careless in it, nothing of the easy charm men used on women they meant to discard. "What do you want, Wren Calloway?" She was quiet for a long moment, watching her breath cloud in the cold air, weighing an answer she had not let herself consider in longer than she could say. "I want to matter to someone," she said finally, "not because I've made myself useful, but simply because I'm myself. I've had a great deal of practice at the first kind. I've had none at all at the second." "Then let me offer you the practice," Julian said quietly, and took her hand, not as a landowner courting a useful connection, but as a man who had watched a woman rebuild an entire valley with her own 2 hands and wanted, more than anything, to be standing beside her when she finally let herself rest. Spring came early to Ashcombe Valley that year. The tenant farms flourished under the cooperative system Wren had built. Fairleigh Hall stood secure for the first time in a decade, and in a quiet ceremony at Thornmere that following autumn, 1 year almost to the day, since a wedding marquee had glowed, with lantern light and cruelty in equal measure, Wren Calloway became mistress of her own estate at last, not as anyone's charity, but as exactly what she had always been: dispensable, unshakable, and finally, fully seen.